Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Nice to see so many of us already in the room. I know a lot more people are joining, so I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go forward. To those who don't know me, my name is Matthew Baird. I've been running the Social Housing Roundtable now for nearly 3 years. As of Thursday, it's actually 3 years since I set up on my own in the social housing space as a recruiter. I've been recruiting for over 11 years now, but the idea when I set up on my own was to try and recruit a bit more ethically and to try and recruit with the idea that if I'm being paid with tenants' money, I'm going to do something a bit better than the general service and actually pay attention to what are the things I can give back. And one of them is this amazing group that we've managed to develop between us. The Social Housing Roundtable was born during COVID. The idea behind it was to bring together anyone and everyone in the social housing space, no matter how you affiliate with it, to have a community of people who can talk ethically, can talk openly, can talk authentically and without judgment, whether you're a housing assistant of a week or whether you're chief executive of 40 years, in a space where everyone can come together, really showcase their views, really showcase what they believe are maybe the issues and the big problems in housing, whilst also then trying to collaborate to really try and make change. Because I think sometimes when you go to some of the conferences, etc., it's the same stories that go on and on and on in terms of talking around a topic rather than talking about it, which brings me today to Kate Still, who is my co-host and guest speaker for this session today. So I'm going to pass on to Kate in a moment just to introduce herself. But when Kate came to me and said, I want to have a session on lived experience and its need for in executive recruitment and need in executive roles in housing, I think we booked it within about 2 weeks. Have you been able to jump on? I mean, it happened that we happened to have a gap, but I wanted to get this on as soon as possible because too often when I speak to people who use recruiters or who use executive search functions, they're looking for people who've got lived experience. They're looking for people who have something different than what they maybe already have within their exec team. And yet it's the same people who kind of get passed around and don't always get the chance to really showcase what views they've got. So I'm going to pass over to Kate to introduce today's session, to start your presentation. If you want to bring any points in during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function, introduce yourselves, etc. in that. We will then have about half an hour or so after the presentation as well to have a really good chat around anything and everything we're discussing today. So without further ado, Kate, I will pass over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. Hope everyone can hear me, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you this morning, and nice to see some people I've worked with before. Hello, I can see some of you there. It's reassuring. Hi, Maria. That's nice. That's a nice feeling that I've got some nice people in the room to support me. That's great. So I'm going to talk this morning about, I'm just going to share my screen, and I am the biggest technophobe ever, so my apologies, I could totally destroy this in the next 2 seconds. Right. Oh, can everybody see that? Is that starting to come up? There we go. Can people see it? Brilliant. Okay, so this morning I'm going to be talking about a programme that I'm running at the moment as part of my organisation. I'm chief executive of a consultancy organisation called Recensa Associates, and we do a range of change and innovation work across not just the housing sector, but the social innovations sector internationally as well. So this project is looking at lived experience insight in housing and the role that has in terms of improving decision making, and also the barriers to lived experience insight within the sector. And we're going to talk a bit later on about the importance of lived experience and what we know academically, both from this sector and from other sectors, about the role of lived experience in driving improved decision making. But before we start off, a little bit of background to me about who I am. So this has a particular resonance with me because I spent 25 years as a tenant living in estate-based social housing in Hemel Hempstead, and 8 as a housing association leaseholder in a different part of the country. I spent 15 years as a housing exec. I was national director of housing at Sanctuary Group for about 6 years. I was COO of Citizen, and I've worked over the last 20 years or so in about, I tossed it up the other day, about 60 associations in different forms as a consultant, executive, interim, and board member. But before I joined the housing sector, I joined housing about halfway through my career. Before that, I was previously the National Social Enterprise Advisor to all of the regional economic development agencies. So I worked internationally, representing the UK across the globe in social innovation spaces. And I also led a pan-European project looking at social innovation and the cultural barriers to social entrepreneurship across Europe. So that was with Oxford Business School and with the United Nations Development Programme in Europe. And that was a really interesting project which really set the foundations for what we're going to talk about today in terms of understanding cultural insight, and in particular cultural barriers to innovation and change in different organisations. I also worked as a public policy advisor in intersectional structure and inequality. That's where my background, my academic background sits really. So I was for a number of years a board advisor to the Homes and Communities Agency, a specialist advisor on intersectional economic inequality. So a little bit of background to me that kind of sets in context some of my kind of skills and experience really. So when I joined the sector, which was in 2008, I kind of was coming out of the social innovation world internationally because the RDAs were being shut down. And I thought, where would be my natural home be really? It would probably be in the housing sector, having grown up in it, having had an academic background studying it. I felt that this would probably be somewhere where I would feel that I was at home. Now, bizarrely, when I joined and continuously as a lived experience leader, this was actually probably my predominant feeling when I was working in social housing, really. That I often felt like I just did not fit in, and I didn't really understand what was happening. I found it very difficult to work out what the cultural codes were in leadership and decision making. And it was something which really bothered me. I was trying to work out, is it me? Am I just getting this fundamentally wrong? Because having come from social innovation, I actually felt very much like I belonged there, that I had a good grasp of how to drive change in those sort of organisations. And when I came to the housing sector, as I say, it felt very different. And because I had such big expectations, I really kind of wondered what that was about. I started talking to some people in the sector, trying to kind of gather insight. Is it just me? Am I doing something fundamentally wrong? And in particular, I tried to seek out people like me who had lived experience to see if that had any element to do with what I was experiencing there. And these conversations often happened kind of behind closed doors. We're sort of in a corner somewhere kind of going, this is what I'm thinking, what are you thinking? And many people talked to me about that they also felt that challenge around how they didn't fit in the sector, and that was a very big challenge in terms of getting their views heard. Going to board level, I then spent time on boards, and I'd often sit in meetings and hear people talk about residents and how difficult it was to get residents with the right background and experience and insight and capability involved in governance. And this was often used as a reason as to why those people were not in those spaces. And again, this is something which I just have never, ever resonated with, because I know the people I grew up with, I know many of the people I've worked with across the country, residents who are vastly experienced and qualified to speak in these spaces and should be there. So this was, again, a kind of a question point to me of why do we think this? And why do these groups of people think that it is so difficult? Because from my point of view, it's pretty easy to get people with that background involved and making a good contribution. So because I kept seeing this across so many organisations, as I say, I've probably been in about 60 organisations over time. And I started to kind of go, this isn't just something that's happening in one organisation. This is a systemic issue that's cutting across multiple organisations and is a cultural problem for us in the sector. So what is that really about? Back in 2017, when Grenfell happened, I decided to start formalising some of that insight by making my own records. And a big reason for that was, after Grenfell happened, we listened to the stories, both in the sector and in the media, about people that had died in that tragedy. And for me, the stark reality of just the total misrepresentation about who residents are really came through in that storytelling, really, is that there was this sort of shock and surprise that people that had died in Grenfell had, master's degrees, had won scholarships to go to very, very elite institutions, that had rich lives, that made huge contribution to society more generally. And it was just really, I found it hugely challenging in that time to be in the sector and to kind of listen to, some of the stories that were being told and the revelations that people were having about who those people were. I found that really, really difficult. So I decided it's time for me to start to think about, how do I try to get that kind of shift in understanding about who people who live in social housing are, and the breadth of that experience, that there is no one view, there are multiple perspectives of people who live in social housing, and that we are just normal people like everybody else, really. So I started that process, gathering insight, seeking out people and having conversations with them about that, and I started writing at that time as well. And what was really interesting is a couple of times I thought about kind of going live with this project a lot earlier. I've written some things that I shared around the sector with different people and asked them what they thought about what I'd written. What came back to me at that point really was a predominant feeling that I shouldn't say it, because if I wanted to progress within the sector, outing myself and kind of like almost, you know, kind of saying this is a problem would itself be seen as a problem that I would probably struggle to progress within that context. And I have to say that's probably true. Because actually what I've felt, and since I launched Lived, I've had people talk to me about how, you know, I should keep quiet because I'm not really a proper resident. You know, I went to an elite institution, I went to the London School of Economics, I went to Oxford Business School, and therefore am I really a resident, and I should probably shut up, really. And again, all that does is it triggers back into this idea that people like me, you know, people across who live in social housing are different to everybody else, and we really are not. So it's trying to challenge that thought and that kind of experience, really, that stigma. So what do we do? Taking a systems thinking view, so that's the kind of academic background of cultural analysis, which is where, you know, my kind of career started, really, is to kind of understand that if this is a repeated issue which is happening across organisations over and over again, it is system driven. So understanding that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets is a real kind of linchpin, I guess, of the methodology of thinking about how systems are interacting with each other. So if this is the case, that this is happening right across the sector, then we've got to think about what are the systemic issues that are making this happen, and how do we get a difference of perspective. I would also say, you know, before we move on to the kind of detail of it, is the importance of lived experience insight. I think we've seen, obviously, I mentioned Grenfell before, but the post office scandal, the terrible things that happened with our Bashak, you know, these implications around damp and mould, Hillsborough, all of these different scenarios and issues that have happened at a society level have at heart a common area, which is that people who were within those systems and who were experiencing the negative outcomes of those systems were not listened to or heard in that environment. So how do we get greater understanding about what's happening in that system and help the people who are in power to understand the implications of their decisions? And in cultural analysis, we talk about this analogy that all cultures are like basically being in a fish tank. If you're inside the fish tank, you think the world looks a certain way. If you're outside of the fish tank, you think it looks completely differently. And understanding what are the parameters of our fish tank as professional housing people, and what are the parameters of our residents' fish tank. These are the kind of two concepts we've got to really think about. So it's really important that we do that. The vital importance of a lived experience leader is that they have multiple views of that system. And that's the essence of this project. It's looking at what can we learn, what can we help to improve in terms of our systems understanding by talking to lived experience about their dual experiences. So it is vitally important that they have the technical background and understanding of the system, of the professional system, and they also have the experiential understanding of that system as well. Okay. So first of all, we also want to say, you know, one of the things that, you know, again, when I talked about to people about this project, is that people start to think that we're trying to suggest that lived experience leadership can also be a proxy for general resident views, and that is not what we're suggesting whatsoever. I think this really comes back to a challenge that we have in the sector around how we use resident insight to drive improvement, is that we have a tendency in kind of the methodologies that we use in the sector to try to sort of categorize at a relatively high level in pretty simplistic terms, you know, in terms of what residents' perspectives are. So we try to kind of categorize them as relatively binary issues, fairly simplistic, universal and representative. And that is really the opposite of what proper insight systems do in terms of understanding the cultural aspects that play in those different areas. So actually, the reality is that the resident perspective is hugely individual, context-driven, intersectional, and system-related. And what we're trying to do in cultural analysis is understand the complexities of those systems and the commonalities across different groups. So we're not looking for universal perspective, we're looking for insight that can help us to improve and work on particular problems. So I think we want to make it really clear at this point that Lived is not trying to provide representative resident insight. And certainly one of the challenges that we see in the sector is that there's a tendency through things like scrutiny panels and governance to kind of think one or two people can represent resident voice, and that is a totally impossible thing to do. So recognising that Lived is not trying to step into that space. So, you know, don't think that you can come along to, you know, Lived and meet some of the people that are in our network and kind of get the kind of golden bullet resident perspective. That's not what this is about at all. Okay. So I think the first thing as we sort of talk about what are we finding in our sort of initial phase of review of a lived experience is, first of all, again, stepping back and understanding the complexity of the housing system. So one of my greatest frustrations is that as I go and talk to different people across the sector, is people repeat this mantra that housing is incredibly simple, right? It's a really simple thing and we should just be able to do it properly. It's actually not. It's incredibly complex because of the systems that overlay and work together to generate outcomes within the housing system. So this is a very simplified diagram of the two predominant parts of the system that the LIVED project is looking at. It's not representative of the entire housing system. If you overlaid all the different systemic elements, there would be hundreds of different systems operating together in this systems view. So these are the two that we are talking about here, is how do we drive improved decision making in the housing sector through lived experience. We have these two dominant areas, so the professional perspective of social housing and the lived experience perspective, and it's recognising the complexity and interconnectedness of each of those systems, really. So these will have systems within systems and have views within views. So, for example, your professional perspective will again be limited and partial based on, where you are in an organisation, your geography, the discipline that you work in, your systemic role, and how much experience you have. And it's kind of recognising all of us have this very fractured view and being really clear about that and understanding whenever we're making decisions, it's thinking to ourselves, how much of my fractured view is limiting my perspective on the wider issues that may be at play in this issue. Now, again, one of the things that we're trying to bring out in LIVED is helping us to understand. So often we spend a lot of wasted time in the sector arguing about differences of perspective and sort of suggesting that one is right and another is wrong. In reality, the challenge that we face in the sector is that there are multiple conflicting and often seemingly opposing perspectives that could all be true at the same time. And our challenge as a sector is to try to deal with that, is not to find the right answer, but to work out how to deal with that level of complexity in our decision making. And that's the essence of what we're trying to achieve through LIVED, essentially. Right, so now we've kind of got the theory, that's a big part of the background to the project. It's just to help to understand and clarify the purpose of LIVED. So what we're trying to do is to use lived experience insight to improve the understanding of the housing system, create an anti-groupthink movement. And if you look at things like, how Grenfell Post Office Horizon scandal happened, the cultural dynamics of groupthink are incredibly powerful. And we must always be thinking as leaders, how much am I participating in a groupthink moment and how am I making decisions, really? So that's a really thing, is to unpack the cultural drivers of groupthink and help ourselves as groups of leaders to organise ourselves in ways which will kind of really, drive that out of our processes, really. And then finally, to help remove the barriers of lived experience leaders to improve the diversity of thought within the sector. And we know from talking to people through our research programme that many people are self-excluding for a number of reasons that we'll talk about in a moment, really. So that's the three purposes of LIVED. Stage of research and development, we are actually only in stage one at the moment. There are 4 stages. The first one is this qualitative and thematic insight process. And what we're trying to do here is get large-scale themes that we can then start to review and investigate at a much more detailed level. Stage 2 will be the quantitative assessment. So once we've got those big themes, working out how much those issues are a big problem within this system. Then stage 4 will be looking at systemic implications for the sector, and stage 3 will be solution. Stage 4, got it the wrong way around. Stage 4 will be solution development. So this session today is just talking about how far we've got so far in that qualitative and thematic insight phase. So stage 1, in this stage, what we're doing, we are a key part of cultural analysis is using ethnographic research methods. So one of the key research methods in ethnography are long-form life histories. So we've been taking at the moment 25 long-form life histories of lived experience leaders, and that helps to give a richness around cultural areas of experience. And we've got people that range from team leaders right up to CEOs and chairs of the board of different organisations taking part in that really rich insight cultural piece. Secondly, we've got a sector-wide lived experience survey, which we've got a link to today, so if you know people who have lived experience, we'd really like as many people as possible to take part in that survey, that will talk about particularly their perceptions of decision-making and their participation in different parts of the sector. We've also got a desktop literature review and an observational study of a range of organisations' leadership and decision-making cultures. And we're pulling that from what we call artefact assessment, so things like business plans, minutes of meetings, etc., but also observational study as well that we've been doing over the last 7 years, essentially. So some of the emerging themes, the things that we're starting to see at this sort of relatively early stage of the insight process, really. First one is about leadership, and we're going to talk about leadership and governance as the main theme today in a moment. But the other areas that we're going to talk about that are emerging very significantly is that we are seeing quite distinct differences, ideological differences of lived experience leaders around the dominant process and purpose of social housing. And that's a really important perspective of how we get ideological difference to be reflected more effectively within the sector, and therefore the focus of what organisations are and the framework that organisations are operating under. Intersectional experience is again another theme, in particular in relation to race. We've had some very, very interesting insight in particular about the dual aspects and barriers around if you have lived experience and you are in particular a Black female, for example. And that's a really, really interesting insight that we're going to be drawing on, is the different components of how lived experience and other intersectional difference operate together to prevent progression within the sector as well. Next area is around child poverty and systems-based trauma. So many of the people, particularly the ones when we've talked them through the long-form life history, will talk to us about systemic trauma that happens through the housing system and the importance of that, the implications that has for life history's progression, and also stigma is really, really important. So we're going to be expanding on that significantly, but it has some very interesting insight that's coming out around both not just systems, but also product specification for housing, around the elements of the product that can drive significant traumatization, particularly of children, which is really interesting. System-based stigmatization, so in particular how the system itself reinforces stigma at a large-scale level. I don't just mean in organisations, but the entire housing system and how that's working, and how stigma is hard-baked into those systems and processes, and what implications that has for, again, when you move into a lived experience leadership space, how that translates over from that lived experience system into the professional system. These are really interesting areas around how stigma carries through if you have lived experience of social housing. And then finally, concept and decision-making frameworks. So again, thinking about what are we learning about the processes of decision-making at particularly executive and board level, and the frameworks that either exclude or include lived experience perspectives. So those are the emerging themes. And as I say, we're going to talk particularly today about leadership and leadership in an executive and governance space, essentially. So what are our lived experience colleagues starting to tell us, really? I think the first insight that we have really is that many people see their lived experience as both a blessing and a curse. Many people have talked to us about the idea of, somebody said to me that they see it as basically what they do is they can see the sector in 2020 vision. They can see the implications of things much more clearly than other people can, because they understand how the systems connect to each other, which is a really important perspective when it's talking about how do we tap into and problem solve some of the things that we're facing. Interestingly, every single person that we've spoken to in the research study so far mentioned to us they were silencing their true feelings and their perspectives to a lesser or greater degree. Okay, that they felt they had to be quiet about what they really thought about certain things, which is a really interesting insight, I think. Everybody, again, had witnessed stigmatisation of residents within organisations. Again, some of that, some of it you would classify as relatively insidious in terms of systems and policy and procedures and things like that. Others was much, much more direct about stigmatisation of residents. So when people are behind the closed doors of an organisation, lived experience leaders are witnessing significant stigmatisation going on. Most were very concerned, and some people talk to me, we work under kind of anonymity principles within the research project, because most people talk to me about how they were very concerned about outing themselves as a lived experience leader, what impact that could have on their career if it was known that they had that background, because of how stigma is cascading into the concepts of who lived experience leaders are, really. All wanted a broader narrative and focus of the role of social housing and society within the sector, and everybody mentioned to us they felt that particularly the economic narratives and the supply-focused narratives were too limiting in terms of what the real systemic issues are in housing issues within the sector, within the country. No one, and when we say no one, we also mean those people that are executive, chief execs and board members, felt that the exec and board as a whole had a good understanding of the reality of living in social housing. And that was a significant challenge in terms of getting their perspectives heard more effectively. And I think finally, the most important thing that's going to really build on what this project is about is that many people had very vital insight into the potential causes and solutions to key problems. And we have started to gather some of that insight really clearly now. And here's a good example of one of the things that was said to us, which I think is a really good, again, systems view of some of the challenges that we face. So thinking about the issue of empathy within the sector, and this was an insight from a lived experience chief exec, actually. this understanding, we are focusing a lot in the sector at the moment around training empathy into people. And, this was a really important insight that actually these issues that we are facing around the lack of compassion within many of our systems means that it's almost impossible for people to be empathetic, particularly if you are at the front line, because you are the kind of receptacle, if you like, of the emotional experiences of residents. And therefore, just the sheer volume of that is too much to hold. And so you've almost got to project and demonize those individuals. Otherwise, the kind of emotional response to it is overwhelming. Now, no doubt there are people who are just unempathetic and don't really care and are stigmatizing residents. But I thought that was a really interesting insight that if we continue just to focus on training individuals, we are not going to crack this problem at all, because we still have systems and processes that basically are uncompassionate and are unhelpful to resolving residents' experiences. So we've got to think about the system as well as thinking about the person that we're training. But that's a good example, I think, of the sorts of insights that we can get through lived experience leadership. Lived experience chairs and CEOs, what do they tell us? Even where a chair or CEO is a lived experience leader, they expressed it was difficult to influence their decision making because of a lack of wider understanding of their perspectives by other leaders. The most common experience that we talked about was people concerned about raising issues repeatedly. There's stuff that came up again and again, or different perspectives coming up where they just didn't agree. They just had to silence themselves because this idea of being labelled as difficult was one of the main barriers to that really working. They didn't want to be labelled as difficult, and that was seen as a huge negative, particularly in chair and exec board level environments. And CEOs and chairs also expressed they were suppressing key parts of their lived experience identity. So identity is something we're expanding on quite a lot. And all of us have multiple aspects to our identity, and many people feel they have to, particularly if you're from a lived experience background, you have to suppress key aspects of that, particularly on the grounds of class, which is interesting. So some of the barriers that we've started to identify through this process really around, why is it difficult to get the lived experience leaders to progress, and also once they're there to actually influence in a positive way. The first one is around thinking about identity, label and journey bias in recruitment. So again, the kind of predominant expectation around, particularly senior exec positions is that you have an academic background, or you have a particular career pathway, which tends to align much more closely with sort of middle class expressions of education, really. So this was a kind of a key thing, that you could be a brilliant leader that has come through the experiential route, but that was often seen as a negative in terms of executive recruitment. The second one is around the cultural roots of behaviour and communication styles. And this is a really interesting one. So in cultural analysis, we talk about the kind of artifacts and behaviours of cultures. How do you become successful in terms of influencing a particular culture? You have to know what those different codes are, what those cultural and behavioural expectations are. And many lived experience leaders have different cultural roots of their behaviour and communication styles. So again, things like, for example, sometimes kind of growing up in many more sort of working class communities, there's a much more direct style, which is often not accepted within some of those kind of other spaces, really, those kind of governance and leadership spaces. So those kind of issues, those sort of very subtle things, but kind of act as a little bit of a trigger of a different identity to the one that is dominating in those different environments, really. The next one is a really interesting one. So we talk a lot in the sector, again, I've been involved in governance training over the years, and, these ideas of being, consensus, alignment and collegiate as being seen as the positive attributes of oiled decision-making teams at exec and collegiate and governance level. In fact, in this space, those three things, many people have talked to us about how they are weaponized often against people as tools of limiting dissent. So, people, again, who are seen as problems because they raise issues that are different to other people, are often is weaponized against them. They're not aligning with people. They're not being collegiate, and these are seen as sort of tools of groupthink. And actually, interestingly, I've been watching the Post Office Horizon scandal. I must have watched about 30 hours now of that scandal. And this is an issue that has come up in the Post Office Horizon scandal. Again, is that it was not seen in that environment that you could dissent, that you would be seen as a problem. If you were kind of outside of that, kind of the norms of that particular decision-making framework. So it's a really important, I think, insight into kind of going how we're using these things, which are supposed to be for good, for potentially limiting people's perspectives, is really important. The lack of skills and processes to manage constructive constructive comments and constructive conflicts, on execs and boards is another area. So again, what tends to happen is if people don't agree, they just leave, or they're pushed out, or they don't extend their tenures because it's just kind of felt like they don't fit in. So there's a lot of kind of exclusion going on through this inability to kind of manage constructive conflict in a good way. The next area really is around, the impact on all of this on lived experience leaders, and why some lived experience leaders are self-excluding from some of these spaces as well. And the emotional labour of all of this can be very, very significant. So the requirement to sort of code switch to be a different person in one space than you are in another space is incredibly debilitating. And having to suppress different key parts of your identity, or feeling that key parts of your identity are not acceptable to certain groups, has a really negative impact in terms of your own, your own self-esteem and self-worth. So these are the kind of emotional labour aspects and barriers that really prevent people from progressing. Next one is the sort of weaponization of legitimate emotions. So many of our lived experience leaders talk about their passion for the subject area. That passion is often misinterpreted as aggression or negativity or anger. And we often see in many of these spaces that people will weaponize the concept of emotional intelligence against people who have that kind of emotional expression, rather than seeing it as a legitimate and justifiable response to oppression, to the experiences of oppression they have witnessed. So emotional intelligence as a concept is a really interesting area that we're seeing coming up again and again in these spaces, of how it can be weaponized against people who have differences of opinion. The next one really is the lack of decision-making frameworks in those spaces. So again, when we've been tracking through decisions at board and executive level, often what we're seeing is a decision is ultimately made on the basis of a power dynamic within a board or executive team, rather than a logical progression of a kind of an idea or a concept, really. So the ability to kind of navigate and influence group dynamic is really, really important. And that's why it's so difficult often for lived experience leaders or anybody who represents difference to really generate a change in decision-making, really. And then finally, the final area of self-exclusion. We talked to many people who were at sort of head of service level and slightly above, maybe director, who maybe might aspire to a more senior position in the long term. And what we were hearing from many of them is that they were going to self-exclude themselves in that progression. They did not want to progress because those spaces were seen as predominantly white, male and middle class. And those were not environments they particularly wanted to be in, because they can see other people who represent their identity not being included properly in those sort of environments. So we've got really, really rich insight already. As I say, we are just in the insight phase of this. Our next step is to kind of work out how much more of an issue this is across the board, and then start to develop tools and solutions. But I'm going to bring that to a bit of a close now. If you are later on, once we've had the discussion, if you are somebody from lived experience who would like to participate in the survey, there's a little link there, which I'm sure Matt can also put up later on. But please do get involved, because we need as many perspectives as possible around the different intersections that we're coming across in lived experience. So I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Kate. And to anybody listening back on the recording, it's www.livedinsight.co.uk/get-involved. And that, like you say, Kate, I'll get that shared around.
Thank you.
Thank you for, a really huge breadth of information. And I think it's really, really interesting looking at what a lot of the academic research and the research you're undertaking is highlighting. There've been a few points in the chat which I'm just going to highlight, but if anybody would like to come in, please do use the raised hand function. Goodness me. And we'll bring you in. I see Kevin's already done it, so bring you in just a moment. Dr. Hannah Absalom, who ran an event with me recently, has put a couple of points in the chat there. So regarding ideological difference, the problem tension seems to be around property as a vehicle for profit, and home as a place of ontological security. We need a clearly articulate conceptualization of home, and followed that up by saying organizations like to think they operate rationally. They don't always. Highlighting role of emotions really does matter, and this includes challenging decision driven by envy, desire, and fostering a culture of open humility. And I know a few of the points you've put in your presentation today that really stuck out to me was around that stigma. And I know you and I, when we were talking before, Kate, when we look at our boardrooms, if you're a good board or if you're trying to be a progressive board, a lot of time people are looking for as much experience as they can from a wide variety of areas, including lived experience, but not just of living in social housing, but maybe of the refugee system or young person scale, whatever it might be. And yet in our exec teams, I know this is something you've realised, quite often like recruits like, and we find that actually that diversity in exec teams is quite difficult to get hold of, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's, we were talking before, I think it's, it's a really interesting comparison. So when I worked in the social innovation sector, it's a very different type of person that is a leader in those kind of spaces. People who are driving really advanced kind of systems thinking and change in a global level. And what I noticed about the difference between that is that we tend to recruit for identity within housing, whereas in the social innovation sector, we recruit for systems thinkers. So again, people who see their job as facilitating a change in the system as opposed to being a figurehead. And I think that's a really interesting difference around why there's a much, I would suggest, a much greater level of diversity of both thought and identity in some of those different spaces. Charity sector are very similar as well, actually. There's obviously a various spectrum of that. But again, in the charity sector, you tend to see people who are operating in a very different skill sets to people that we're recruiting in housing.
I'm going to jump to a couple of points in the chat in a moment, but Kevin, I'm going to bring you in first. Good to have you with us today.
Hi guys. I mean, this is a fantastic session. I did a post on my LinkedIn just earlier this week, I think, that tried to articulate this point exactly, Kate, in that I have a lot of lived experience in social housing. So I work for a software supplier, and I've worked for a number of software suppliers, but originally came from Anchor Hanover. So within housing, I've lived in housing. And a lot of those points you mentioned, I resonate with. Absolutely. And trying to progress in a career when 95% of the job adverts say that you need a degree in computer science. Well, I was just never in a position where I could have gained that. But I've lots of experience of and have been very fortunate that I've been able to progress my career. But one point I do want to pick up on was the very last you made there, where it said, a lot of boardrooms are middle-aged white men. And actually, been thinking very recently about trying to become a non-executive director or maybe move into be more of a director of IT. And I've been put off by that exactly because there are already a lot of middle-aged white men. Mm. Why would they need another? So although I've got all of this great experience, I feel that I could offer a lot to these organizations. I've often looked at their boards and thought, there are already 5 or 6 of me there. Why do they need another one of me? So yeah, that was just my thoughts on it anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a different issue, particularly for men at the moment. This the intersectional position of men in this kind of system is really interesting and challenging. I think this is about us kind of moving beyond the kind of labels and to kind of go. And it's interesting. This week was it Kemi Badenoch wrote an article, I think it was in the Times or something like that, about the intersectional differences of Black experience and how they are vastly different. And I think this is the thing that we need to understand when we're recruiting. If we're recruiting men into that space. And this is not a campaign to not recruit men into that space per se, but it's about saying, okay, what does that person bring? What's the difference that they bring? And what are the different components of their identity and their experience? And how does that add insight, and systemic insight into decision making? And that's essentially what we do. But what we tend to do is kind of go men, women, Black people or whatever, and we see them as just like these very kind of, singular things, which people are not. They're very complex.
Couldn't agree more, and I can see Lara in the chat, who no doubt will have plenty to say on that at some point. And that's great to have us with us. I'm going to bring in Hannah in just a moment. There's a couple of other points I wanted to bring in from the chat, which was firstly, so Joe Leckie had said when training, she sees lived experience delegates suppressing their identity after a while because of the response of their colleagues if they regularly feed in their thoughts and feelings. And I probed a little bit into that, and she's mentioned there that what she finds is that people in the room often display what I find is that people in the room often display negative body language when people with lived experiences articulate their views. As Kate said, this may be because that person regularly airs their views and are perceived as being difficult. And is this what you're finding in your work too?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it is my own lived experience is that I'm often seen as a difficult person because I say the thing I see, right? Or I say what I think. And, it's kind of going, those people that, and it's the labels that we use about those people. If somebody's repeatedly raising an issue that you don't resonate with, it's being curious about that. Where does that come from? Rather than kind of going, I just don't agree with you and shut up, So it's how do we foster a culture where people who have different perspectives feel valued in their perspective? And certainly I mean, bizarrely, because my identity, you know, I grew up in the home counties. Now, if you knew my background, it's like, you know, it's complete opposite of what I present as, right? And that's a challenge, is that my identity, who I really am, is not what people see. But because I have this perception of having a, you know, a home counties accent, and I went to, I went to 2 elite institutions, Oxford and LSE, that I cannot possibly, you know, I need to shut up even more, because, you know, who am I? I'm not really a resident, am I? And it's this kind of frustration of we see people just on the surface and not the actual experiences. You know, so it's trying to be a lot more curious about who people are, and, you know, and kind of not devaluing people because of their initial impression of that they kind of project to you in that sense.
And actually, that's been backed up by someone who's just mentioned in the chat there that they've had to suppress expressing their views, as I've been called difficult, and I've caught my manager asking another manager to not let me talk at the meeting. And this is part of the problem. But I think equally that's society wide. And
yeah,
you know, when we've looked at stuff like, you know, anything in the political climate at the moment, if you're, I don't know, pro-conservative, pro-Labour, pro this, pro that, rather than going why and discuss it, is immediately, oh well, they're wrong, they are a bad person, they're whatever. The labels associated with that are becoming stronger and stronger. Hannah, I'm going to bring you in before going back to the chat. Good to have you with us today.
Yeah, I couldn't not attend today because I just thought there was so much resonance in my own area of research. So I wanted to just sort of connect there. I'll drop a link in the chat to me domestic abuse resource, because that engages with how to engage with difficult emotions in the context of complex real world problems, but in a normal plain English way. I would say a fundamental problem within the sector is this: we lack a coherent professional identity, and it's really good to see in policy making this notion of the sector's professionalism is being debated and discussed. One of my worries is that just becomes another means of importing sort of private sector ideologies, which are just going to compound this spreadsheet thinking problem, which is how I tend to think of it. Of like, you know, reductive numbers versus expansive emotions. So I would encourage Kate and others to feed back in that government consultation that's happening about professional standards, because that's the opportunity to get this heard and shaping practice. I was also thinking as well, there's an issue of, you know, the stigma is this perennial issue in housing. And we need to understand and have this culture where we trust tenants to account for themselves. And I think we really need to do something with this vulnerability thread that exists in housing that is contributing to this distance between practitioners and tenants, and is justifying all sorts of problematic interventions. But I just wanted to flag the consultation that's open at the moment. I'll try and find the link and drop it in the chat, and just say absolutely brilliant. I'm really pleased this stuff is happening, and please feel people who are interested message me on LinkedIn. It will inform and shape my research agenda. It's exactly the space I'm interested in. So thank you.
I think, like you, Hannah, I'm really worried about the be professional thing, because to me that's some of that, the behavioural code behind that is, you know, this stuff about the kind of thing about groupthink again. It's like, you know, be collegiate, but what do those things mean? What do you mean be collegiate? What do you mean, you know, align? You know, it can be a code of control. And so I think, you know, it's really important that we understand, that we start to expand that a little bit around what appropriate behaviours are and what they are not. Because it, you know, this what I'm seeing in my research and my own personal experiences, these are the primary mechanisms of control of narrative and ideology. And that's what we've got to think about, is how do we allow people who think differently to succeed and push through in that, in order to drive better decision making in the sector as a whole.
Without wishing to plug a different event, in 10 days on the 23rd, so a week on Friday, the CIH are coming on to do a special roundtable at 2 p.m. to discuss the professionalism, conduct and competency consultation. So we'll be doing a strong hour just purely on that. And I think points like yours are absolutely vital that are made. I've openly said on LinkedIn, I'm worried about a bit like social care, it being, well, is it easier just to recruit someone who's already got the qualification, and the barriers that might pertain? It'd be interesting to see what happens with executives in the space who aren't academic but who've delivered amazingly over the years, and other heads of service, and where those barriers are in. So there's a lot for us to discuss in there. Going back to the chat, Morris had pointed out, and this was in relation to Kevin coming on, that, you know, you could be the voice that includes those who haven't already been included, and that's something that I think is vital from a chair's perspective as well, to really understand, as Kate's pointed out, that there are, just because you're a white guy doesn't mean you don't have other elements, and it's going, right, well, what are you adding to the board that we haven't already got? And it's the same with anybody from any ethnicity or gender or anything else. Kim Sutton, I've lived experience as a child of being homeless and in a family where my parents are working class, and I have a very strong South London accent. I have a law degree, just completed my master's, yet when I open my mouth, there's a perception of me, especially if they've only heard me on Zoom or telephones, and she also refuses to lose her South London accent. Unfortunately, my Devonshire accent did fade, otherwise this would be a very different thing. But this is something that, Kate, I know you and I have talked about as well, is people adapting to be who they feel they need to be to progress rather than being their authentic selves, which takes away from the true delivery of service and true change being made.
It's really difficult. When I went to LSE, I made a conscious decision. I have a North London accent. I made a conscious decision to get rid of it, and it's now so ingrained in me. And people, I think I've overcorrected because many people think I went to private schools, and but it was an active decision. I knew I didn't fit in there, and so I had to adapt, around all of the kind of private schools in order to progress. And you kind of go at an individual level. That's a very common sense thing to do, because I probably wouldn't. It is a barrier. That's the pragmatic decisions that your people are making, but it shouldn't be the case, And we've got to think about really carefully how those dominant cultures, have to be open to challenging themselves and their perceptions. Because us just trying to push in is very, very difficult. And I think the thing about emotional labour in all of this is that whether it's women, lived experienced colleagues, Black colleagues, all of us are expected to take on the emotional labour of making this change. So we're the ones that are trying to force it through, making the effort, and everybody else just sitting there nicely, just getting on with it. So kind of recognising when you bring people onto these different forums and you want them to represent something, that takes a lot of emotional courage, labour, and it's exhausting because you have to suppress yourself all the time, and it's very, very difficult.
And this is I think judging just purely on accent, it's a real shame with what Kim said before, because I say you and I, whatever your accent, becomes more neutralized. And yet, like I say, I grew up in Plymouth. I grew up in Maricourt Estate, in the back end of a relatively rough area of Plymouth, because Dad was in the Marines and Mum was a nurse. That was what it was. But perceptions are everything. It's a really difficult thing to shift. Morris saying that I used to suppress my views, being the only Black guy in an office, but then I realised that I needed to educate and further sometimes explain to people for them to understand. I started to find that those who understood got it and changed the way they viewed and spoke to me. However, there was still a large amount of people who ignored and just decided to make life difficult for me with unnecessary comments and remarks, which I found was the norm. I ended up leaving that organisation as I realised it wasn't the right culture for me. And firstly, thank you for being so candid and honest there in terms of what you shared. But I have never learned more about Black culture, Black experience, and everything else than from starting to date and now being engaged to a Black woman and speaking to Lara. And that's because there'd been the opportunity there to have an authentic conversation and kind of go, right, this is judgment free. This is me saying to you, and that's authentic. I go, I don't understand because I don't have that experience. Talk. And then I had to listen. And that was the big difference. It was being willing to listen and kind of go, cool, well, I didn't know that. And that's shaping your view. And I think so often, and this is something I've talked with many people about on the roundtable and other platforms, Kate, is that we say we want to have these surveys, we want to have all this work done, we get all the data through, and then it goes onto a system and it just kind of gets left. And no one's actually using that information to change anything in the business.
Yeah. No, it's incredibly challenging. And I think the thing about, again, at a leadership level, what we need to kind of accept is when people tell you their perspective, it's not your job to tell them they're wrong. I get this all the time. I talk about my experience, thinking, oh no, that didn't happen. Oh, so you were in my life, were you 20 years ago? You were there. And it's like, this is my experience. I'm allowed to own my experience. Your opinion of it is irrelevant. And we need to kind of take that approach with everybody that talks to us about this. It's kind of going, listening to people's perspective and accepting it as it is. Right, because at the very least, even if that wasn't completely exactly how it happened, that was the meaning they took from it, and that's really important insight. And as a principle of gathering insight, the applied meaning that people put on these systems is probably the most important aspect of, if you want behavioural change or you want systems change, is understanding applied meaning is probably the most foundational aspect of that. I think interestingly as well, going back to Hannah's work, my view of housing, and I've talked about this is why at Citizen I led a campaign called Home is a Foundation for Life. It's the psychological basis of all psychological safety for people, right? So all of these narratives that we have in the sector about supply and economics, and people not being able, you're not tenancy ready, etc. These are kind of like all things which actually kind of distract us from the fact that this is the foundational psychological framework of people's survivability as a species. So let's start looking at it like that. But it's just frustrating, I think, for many of us that have got lived experience, who have come from difficult trauma backgrounds, many of us, to kind of go, that was my savior, and yet you see it as a kind of commoditized product or a transaction, right? And I think that's the primary difference I see in terms of lived experience leaders and people who haven't got lived experience.
There's a point there from the chat from Joe Lum. She's been shut down in conversation because I have moved on from my past. And I think this is a bit your point, actually, Kate, really backs it up. I find my corner because my past gives me a unique ability to add value to conversation. But I am guilty historically of hiding my background due to feeling of not being seen as good enough. My current role, I have for the first time felt that all my knowledge and lived experience is valued. And I think this is something which seems to be resonating through the chat. Joe's mentioned she used to have an Essex accent. I similarly worked on that over the years because of the perception. Hannah shared the link for the competence and conduct standards, so thank you for doing that. And Joe's mentioned that during our training we say, I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right. Morris, people forget to listen to what's actually being said. We as humans are so quick to just react and talk without taking a second to take into account surroundings and context of what is being said. And Ali, I haven't got anything to say immediately, but thank you for this conversation, enjoying it so much. And it's great to see that it is not Lara raising the voice alone. The leadership needs to be diverse to put the skills, knowledge, experience, and most importantly, the desire without the lens of accent, judgment, or other backgrounds. And my concern with all of this is that this isn't a new conversation. This isn't something which we're kind of saying, right, let's revolutionize the sector by having this. Going into the last few minutes now, and we've got about 5 minutes left, how doing a piece of research like yours will definitely have an impact. Doing stuff like the consultation will hopefully have an impact. But when my biggest concern is still that the voices we need to change, or the mindset that needs to change, is those with the executives in the housing space. And I was talking to a good friend of mine at the Housing Tech Conference last week at Edgbaston. And if anyone wants to do a conference at Edgbaston, by the way, A, it was great. B, it's a 20-minute, half an hour walk from my house. It was lovely not to have to travel far, but that's a completely side thing. And he was saying, and it was a conversation Kate and I had before the roundtable today, which is that when you can get to an exec space for a considerable period of time, people can almost forget what it's like to try and struggle through the day-to-days that people are going through now. And I put something through on LinkedIn recently, which is that we were talking about housing burnout, we were talking about trauma, and why people are taking more sick leave. And it was a chief exec I was speaking with, and we kind of got to the crux of the matter being that actually you can talk about, you go in, you deliver all you have all this trauma dumped on you through work because it's a traumatic sector to work in. Let's not get away from that. And you go home and you're still struggling to make your bills. You're still struggling to do anything because cost of living is so high, because businesses can't pay more, etc., etc. So how do we get that big shift now in that exec space when a lot of execs have been in those positions for a considerable period of time, and yet change isn't already coming through? And Kate, I don't know if there's any thoughts you've had from the research you've already been undertaking in terms of how we can really start making swift change, because it's clearly needed.
I think some of it, I mean, my aspiration is that through Lived, we kind of out some of the cultural code, and that so much of this stuff isn't about people working to formal board frameworks. So much of this is just about group dynamic, right? And how we kind of out and inform people about, you are just doing this on group dynamic. It's not, and I guess my only kind of hope of it is that I do think I am sensing there's a groundswell of more senior people like myself, like Lara, who've had experience at a very senior level, starting to speak out and have that courage, because we're now outside of that set, well, we're not in organisations anymore. And part of the reason I'm out of an organisation is I wanted to be able to talk about this stuff a lot more. So I think it is about trying to build a groundswell of that, and that disruptive forces tend to be external. It doesn't tend to happen from within within a sector like that. It has to come from some kind of external pressure. And Lara and I actually talked the other day. You think about the impact that Quajo Treneboa has had on the sector in the last couple of years. If Quajo was a lived experience leader inside a housing association, he would have been put through an HR process, right? So it's kind of going, outside of the sector, he's seen as a hero. If he was inside the sector, he would have been put through an HR process. So it's kind of going, how do we create disruptive forces externally that can start to drive this change more effectively? Because it is about breaking through a cultural dynamic which really has no incentive to change, because it's a power control, it's a control dynamic, right? So how do we create that from an external perspective more effectively?
This is something that drives me absolutely crazy, exactly on your point there, which is that we decide, you know, that the people in this room today who I know well, who have been brilliant in the sector, worked in it for years, tried to have this voice, got nowhere, got shut down, left, become consultants, started being paid to be a consultant at a higher salary than they want, and then they're listened to saying exactly the same stuff they were saying when they were part of the job. But because they're now an external consultant, it's suddenly like it's a more powerful message. And so I'd love to see that change more. And I'd love to see us really listen to those people in our businesses who don't have the same background as us and go, well, actually, are we getting something wrong here because we've just made assumptions? Kate, I've just put the link to your site in the chat. Thank you so much. Like I say, www.livedinsight.org/get-involved. Please do reach out to Kate with any of the thoughts, queries, follow-ups from today, because that'd be amazing. I know you're active on LinkedIn as well, so please go find Kate still there. Normally I'd be saying next week, but actually the next roundtable is Thursday, because the CIH have sponsored a couple of events. So on Thursday, we'll be discussing Awab's Law, energy efficiency and the future home standards. So if you wish to join, it's exactly the same link as you've used today. You can join us. And then next week, there are 2 sessions again. The first will be on social purpose and DLOs. And then Friday will be that professionalism one that we've already discussed today. But I just want to take this chance to say a massive thank you to Kate, to wish you the very best with the rest of your assessment and everything that you're doing at the moment, because it sounds like it's going to be an incredibly powerful piece of work. When are you hoping to have it finished by?
Well, it'll be ongoing. It's a kind of what they call a longitudinal study. So we'll release different aspects of it as we've got enough insight from each phase. I would say if you're at the tenant engagement conference for Inside Housing in May, doing a special session, I think on the plenary there, around this concept. So we'll start to expand a bit more, and hopefully have more kind of participation by that point as well.
Fantastic. I also just want to say a final thank you to everybody who was able to share today, because there was some really honest and quite powerful stuff shared in the chat and shared in the speech. So I appreciate you all. The recording of this will go live very soon, but if anybody wants to reach out about future roundtables or your recruitment needs, please do reach out. But for now, Kate, a massive thank you to you, and look forward to seeing you all at an event soon. Take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye.